The streets were unusually quiet that evening, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost foreboding. Naomi Jackson wheeled herself down the uneven sidewalk, her sharp eyes scanning her surroundings with an awareness born of experience. At 35, Naomi had seen her fair share of challenges, but she had never let her disability define her. Her ebony skin glowed under the dim streetlights, and her thick locks, tied back in a loose bun, swayed gently as she moved. Tonight was just another night, or so she thought. Naomi lived in a neighborhood that wasn't known for its hospitality. The area was rough, plagued by gang activity and the sort of casual cruelty that came from people who felt powerless in their own lives. But Naomi had never been the type to cower. She had survived too much, endured too many battles, both physical and emotional, to let fear guide her. Still, as she rolled past the shuttered shops and dark alleys, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. Something wasn't right. Behind her, a group of 5 men stepped out of the shadows. Their laughter was low and mean, carrying a venom that made Naomi's stomach tighten. She didn't need to turn around to know they were following her. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their intentions pressing against her back like a physical force. "Hey, where you think you're going so fast?" one of them called out, his voice laced with mockery. Naomi stopped, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair. She took a slow, deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Fear was natural, but panic could get you killed. She turned her chair slightly, just enough to glance at the men without fully facing them. They were young, maybe in their 20s, dressed in baggy clothes and hoodies that obscured their faces. But their posture, the casual arrogance, the predatory gleam in their eyes, told her everything she needed to know. They were looking for trouble. "I'm just heading home," Naomi replied evenly, her voice steady but firm. "I don't want any problems." One of them snorted. "Home? Ain't no homes around here, lady. You lost or something." The tallest of the group stepped closer, his broad shoulders blocking out the faint glow of the streetlight. "You think you're too good to talk to us, rolling around like you own the place." Naomi's jaw tightened. She wasn't a stranger to this kind of hostility. As a black woman, she had faced her share of racism and prejudice. As a disabled person, she had endured the pitying stares, the dismissive comments, the assumptions that she was weak. But these men didn't just see her as vulnerable, they saw her as a target. And that was their first mistake. "Look," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous calm. "I don't want to hurt anyone. Just let me pass." The men burst into laughter, the sound echoing off the empty buildings. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned in close. "You don't want to hurt us." "Oh, that's rich. What you gonna do, lady? Run us over with your chair." The group erupted in laughter again, but Naomi didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her back, her hands resting lightly on her wheels. Beneath her composed exterior, something cold and lethal stirred. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. Naomi Jackson wasn't just a disabled woman trying to get by in a tough neighborhood. She was a former Special Forces operative, one of the most highly trained and dangerous soldiers to ever wear the uniform. Her combat skills were unparalleled, her instincts razor-sharp. And though she had retired years ago, the lessons she had learned, the reflexes, the strategies, the sheer will to survive, had never left her. But she didn't want to use those skills. Not tonight, not unless she had to. "Walk away," she said, her voice low but commanding. "This is your only warning." The tall man sneered, stepping even closer. "Or what? You gonna?" Before he could finish, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Naomi's hand darted to the small pouch on the side of her chair, and in one fluid motion, she produced a sleek tactical baton. With a flick of her wrist, the weapon extended with a sharp metallic click, the sound slicing through the night like a warning shot. The men froze, their bravado faltering for the first time. Naomi's eyes locked onto the leader, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Last chance," she said, her voice as cold as steel. For a moment, there was silence. The gang exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shaken by the sudden shift in power. But then, one of them, the wiry man with the scar, reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife. "You think that little stick's gonna scare us?" he growled, stepping forward. Naomi's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of amusement or even confidence. It was the kind of smile that promised consequences, severe ones. "Your move," she said softly, and with that, the tension snapped like a taut wire. The men lunged, their arrogance driving them forward. But they had no idea that they were stepping into the jaws of a lion. The first man lunged toward Naomi with a cocky grin, his knife catching the dim light as it swiped toward her. Naomi didn't flinch. Her mind was already calculating distance, angles, speed. She moved with a precision that came from years of training, spinning her wheelchair slightly to the side, causing the man to stumble past her. In the same instant, a baton struck out, connecting with the back of his knee. He collapsed to the ground with a pained yell, his weapon clattering to the pavement. The others hesitated for just a second too long, clearly not expecting her to fight back. That hesitation was all Naomi needed. She maneuvered her wheelchair with practiced ease, her movements fluid and deliberate. The second man came at her from the side, swinging a rusty pipe, but Naomi ducked low, her baton sweeping upward to disarm him. The pike flew out of his hands and hit the ground with a metallic clang. But this wasn't just about her training. It wasn't just about skill. Naomi had something these men didn't: control. They were fueled by anger, by the rush of trying to assert dominance. She, on the other hand, was calm, her focus unshakable. Every move she made was deliberate, every strike calculated to incapacitate rather than harm unnecessarily. The leader, the tall man with the sneer, stepped back, his confidence visibly crumbling. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In their minds, Naomi was just a woman in a wheelchair, an easy target for their cruelty. They hadn't anticipated the storm they'd unleashed. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was more unnerving than any threat could be. She kept her eyes on the group, her baton held steady in her hand, waiting for the next move. She could feel the tension in the air, the shift as the remaining men began to question whether this fight was worth it. But Naomi wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting the person she had worked so hard to become. The woman she had become after years of struggle and sacrifice. The person who had fought her way back from the brink, refusing to let the world break her. Years ago, Naomi had been one of the best. A special forces operative known not just for her skill, but for her ability to adapt to any situation. She had been sent on missions most people wouldn't survive, completing them with a determination that bordered on superhuman. But her career had come to an abrupt end during a covert mission gone wrong. An explosion had left her with injuries so severe that doctors said she'd never walk again. For a while, Naomi had believed them. She had sunk into a darkness she hadn't thought she could escape. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight of losing the life she had built, the identity she had forged through blood, sweat, and tears. But Naomi wasn't one to give up, not entirely. It had taken years of therapy, both physical and emotional, to rebuild herself. And while she no longer served in the military, she had found a way to keep going, to create a new life for herself. The wheelchair didn't define her. It was just another tool, like her baton, like the instincts that had kept her alive for so long. But she didn't flaunt her past. She didn't tell people who she used to be or what she was capable of. She had learned the hard way that people could be dangerous when they felt threatened by what they didn't understand. Tonight, though, she had no choice but to reveal a glimpse of the person she once was, the person she still could be when pushed to the edge. The wiry man with the scar scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. "You think you're tough, huh? You think you can take all of us?" He looked around at his crew, trying to rally them. "Come on, she's just one woman. Don't let her punk us like this." But Naomi could see the cracks forming in their resolve. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone they had deemed powerless. She could see the fear behind their bravado, the doubt creeping into their expressions, and she knew she could use that. "I told you to walk away," Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. "This doesn't have to get worse." The leader clenched his fists, his pride battling with his survival instincts. He glanced at his fallen comrades, at the weapons scattered on the ground, and for a moment it looked like he might back down. But then something changed. His expression hardened, and he pulled a phone from his pocket, his fingers flying across the screen. "You're gonna regret this," he snarled. "We're not done." Naomi's jaw tightened. She knew what that meant. Reinforcements. This wasn't just a random group of thugs. They were part of something bigger, something she didn't have all the pieces of yet. And if she didn't act fast, she'd be facing a lot more than 5 angry men. Her mind raced, assessing her options. She could stay and fight, but that would only escalate things further. She could call the police, but in this neighborhood, response times were unreliable at best. And the last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself, to have her name and face tied to an incident that could bring her past back to the surface. No, she needed to get out of there, but not before sending a message. Naomi wheeled herself closer to the leader, her baton tapping lightly against the pavement with each turn of her wheels. He flinched, stepping back instinctively, but she didn't stop until she was right in front of him. She leaned forward, her voice low and cold. "Tell whoever's coming that they don't want this fight," she said. "Tell them to think long and hard about what they're walking into. Because if they come after me, they won't like what they find." She let the words hang in the air for a moment before straightening up and turning her chair around. Without another word, she rolled away, her movements steady and deliberate, even as her heart pounded in her chest. As she disappeared into the shadows, the gang stood frozen, their bravado shattered, their leader clutching his phone with shaking hands. They didn't know it yet, but they had made a mistake that would ripple far beyond this night. Because Naomi wasn't just a woman defending herself. She was a force to be reckoned with, a storm waiting to be unleashed. And while she had left the battlefield behind, she hadn't forgotten how to fight. She never would. Naomi's hands gripped the wheels of her chair tightly as she rolled through the dark streets, her mind working as fast as her movements. She took the long way home, weaving through narrow alleys and side streets she knew well, keeping an eye out for anyone who might be following her. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but she forced herself to stay calm. Panic clouded judgment, and she couldn't afford that now. As she approached her apartment building, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The street was empty, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that usually came before a storm. Naomi knew she had sent a message to the gang, but she also knew how dangerous desperate people could be. If they felt cornered, they might come back harder, and she had no illusions about how far they'd go to save face. Inside her apartment, Naomi locked the door and slid the deadbolt into place. Her one-bedroom unit was small but functional, with sparse furniture and walls painted in neutral tones. She liked it that way, simple, quiet, and easy to secure. She moved to the corner of the room, where a locked metal case sat on a low shelf. Her fingers hovered over the lock, debating whether to open it. The case contained weapons, some from her military days and others she had acquired legally after her retirement. She had hoped she wouldn't need them again, but tonight had changed things. Naomi decided against opening it, at least for now. Instead, she powered up her laptop and opened an encrypted messaging app. She had maintained contact with a handful of trusted allies from her military days, people who knew the truth about her and what she was capable of. If the gang's retaliation escalated, she needed to be prepared. She typed a quick message to an old friend, someone who owed her a favor, and sent it off before closing the laptop. As the night wore on, Naomi found herself replaying the events in her mind. She had handled the immediate threat, but the gang's leader wasn't bluffing when he called for reinforcements. She had seen the look in his eyes, fear mixed with pride, a dangerous combination. Whoever they were bringing in, it wouldn't just be more of the same. It would be worse. The thought made Naomi's chest tighten, but she pushed it aside. She had faced worse odds before. The question wasn't whether she could handle them. It was whether she could do so without drawing too much attention to herself. The last thing she wanted was for her past to come to light, for someone to dig into the records she had worked so hard to bury. The next morning, Naomi stuck to her usual routine, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. She wheeled herself to the local grocery store, keeping her movements casual but her eyes sharp. The store was busy, the hum of conversation blending with the beeping of checkout scanners. Naomi was reaching for a can of soup on a high shelf when she heard a voice behind her. "Need a hand with that?" She turned to see a young man with a warm smile and kind eyes. He looked familiar, one of her neighbors maybe. She nodded, forcing a small smile. "Thanks." He grabbed the can and handed it to her. "No problem. I've seen you around. You're in the building down the street, right?" Naomi hesitated. She didn't like small talk, especially with strangers, but his demeanor seemed genuine. "Yeah, that's me." "I'm Marcus," he said, extending a hand. "Moved in a couple of months ago." "Naomi," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. "Nice to meet you." As Marcus walked away, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't him, exactly. He seemed harmless enough, but the timing felt too coincidental. She finished her shopping quickly and headed home, her mind racing with possibilities. Was she being paranoid, or was someone keeping tabs on her? Later that evening, as she double-checked the locks on her door, Naomi's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a response to the message she had sent the night before. The text was brief, but to the point. "I'll look into it. Be careful." Naomi exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She didn't like relying on others, but in this case, she didn't have much choice. If the gang was part of a larger network, or worse, connected to someone with resources, they could pose a real threat. And if her past came out in the process, it wouldn't just be her life at risk. The night was quiet, but Naomi didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the street below, her baton within arm's reach. Hours passed, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. She was starting to think the gang might have backed off when the sound of approaching footsteps caught her attention. Naomi's muscles tensed as she peered through the blinds. A group of 6 men stood across the street, their voices low but animated. They weren't the same men from the night before, but their posture and demeanor were familiar, confident, predatory. One of them pointed toward her building, and Naomi's stomach sank. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. She backed away from the window, her mind already formulating a plan. The gang had underestimated her once, but she knew they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. This time they would come prepared, and so would she. Naomi stayed perfectly still, her breathing shallow as she listened for any sound from the street below. The men were still outside, their muffled voices a constant reminder that trouble was just a few feet away. She couldn't make out their exact words, but their movements were deliberate, purposeful. This wasn't just a group of thugs wandering aimlessly. They had a plan. She rolled away from the window and reached for her baton, gripping it tightly as her mind raced. Her apartment wasn't a fortress, but it was defensible. The layout played to her advantage, with narrow hallways and limited entry points. If they came for her, she wouldn't need brute strength, just precision and the element of surprise. Still, she didn't want it to come to that. If she could avoid a confrontation, she would. But something told her these men weren't here to talk. Her phone buzzed on the table, startling her. She grabbed it quickly and saw a text from her old friend, the one she had reached out to for help. Confirmed. Local gang, but they're answering to someone bigger. They're testing you. Be ready for anything. Testing her. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Whoever was pulling the strings wanted to see how she would react, to gauge whether she was a threat worth neutralizing or something they could exploit. Naomi clenched her jaw. She hated being seen as a pawn in someone else's game, but she couldn't let her emotions get the better of her. She needed to stay sharp. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside her door. Naomi's heart raced as she rolled silently to the peephole. Through the small glass, she saw a shadow move across the dimly lit corridor. One of them was scouting the building, checking for vulnerabilities. She watched as the figure stopped in front of her door, hesitating for a moment before moving on. Her grip on the baton tightened. They were probing, trying to gauge her defenses. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Naomi waited, her senses on high alert. She didn't know how long she sat there, listening to every creak and shuffle, but eventually the voices from outside grew louder. She returned to the window and peeked through the blinds. The group was crossing the street now, their movements less cautious, more confident. They weren't hiding anymore. They were coming. Naomi rolled back to the center of the room, her mind running through every scenario she could think of. She had already disabled the main light, leaving the apartment dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner. Shadows danced across the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a battlefield than a home. She positioned herself near the door, her baton in one hand and her phone in the other. If things went south, she had a direct line to the police, but she knew they might not arrive in time. The first knock came unexpectedly gentle, almost polite. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't move. The second knock was louder, followed by a voice. "Hey, we just want to talk." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The doorknob rattled, and Naomi's pulse quickened. She could hear them murmuring to each other on the other side, their voices too low to make out. Then came the sound of something metal sliding against the lock, a makeshift tool, clumsy but effective. They were trying to break in. Naomi rolled back slightly, positioning herself at an angle where she could see the door but remain out of immediate sight. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. The first man stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. He was tall and wiry, with a scar running down the side of his face. Behind him, 2 others crowded into the doorway, their postures tense, ready for a fight. "Where are you hiding, sweetheart?" the scarred man called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "We just want to have a little chat." Naomi didn't respond. She waited, letting the tension build, letting them feel the weight of the silence. The scarred man moved further into the room, his companions following closely. One of them carried a crowbar, the other a small knife. They weren't playing around. As the first man reached the center of the room, Naomi struck. Her baton lashed out, catching him in the side of the knee. He collapsed with a grunt, the sound of bone meeting metal echoing through the apartment. The others reacted instantly, their weapons raised, but Naomi was already moving. She spun her wheelchair to the side, her baton sweeping out to knock the knife from the second man's hand. The third man swung the crowbar, but Naomi ducked, the heavy metal missing her by inches. She countered with a sharp jab to his wrist, forcing him to drop his weapon. The fight was fast and brutal, each movement precise, each strike calculated to incapacitate without causing unnecessary harm. Naomi's training took over completely, her body acting on muscle memory. But even as she held her ground, she knew this wasn't over. These men were just the beginning, a test to see how far she would go. Whoever had sent them would be watching, waiting to see how she handled herself. And when they saw what she was capable of, they wouldn't back off. They would escalate. As the last man crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain, Naomi wheeled herself toward the door and locked it again. Her chest heaved as she caught her breath, her mind already racing ahead. She had sent a message tonight, but it wouldn't be enough to stop what was coming. If anything, it would draw more attention, more danger. She didn't know who was behind this or why they had targeted her, but one thing was clear: they had underestimated her, and they wouldn't make that mistake again.